what we're going to be going over here is job order costing, where we're going to look at actual versus normal costing. So we're going to be looking at job order costing here from the perspective of a manufacturing operation. Here we're going to be tracking a job cost on an individual basis. So say for example, this factory here manufactures equipment, and each piece of equipment is a bit different here. So what you want to do is you want to track the cost of each piece of that equipment here on an individual basis. Okay, so when we're talking about job order costing here, we're looking at our actual costing versus normal costing. So what goes into the product here would be material, labor, and then overhead here. So those are the three elements that go into the cost here of that product, and we're going to be costing it out here individually here for each of the jobs. Okay, so what we want to do here, the difference between our actual costing and our normal costing, well, we would, if you the direct material here and the direct labor, you would use their actual costs here for both actual costing and normal costing, and that's really taking the actual cost times the quantity used. And I might want to point out here, we also could have actual costs for indirect material here and also indirect labor here. Now, if we can keep our indirect material and indirect labor here separate from our actual overhead that we're going to apply, then we would do that here. So when we're talking about indirect material and labor here, it might be like the maintenance department here supporting this particular job that you're running through the factory, and they can determine exactly how much material they're using here at the actual cost, and also they could keep track of their labor hours here. And even though they're called indirect labor hours and indirect material, we can keep track of it here, or attach it directly here to the job that we're performing here, or that individual job. So in that case, you might want to include your indirect material and indirect labor here at their actual costs and the actual quantities that they're used. Now, if you can't do that, then it would have to be lumped into the actual overhead that you have to be calculating. So you can see here, there's no real difference between actual costing and normal costing here for job order costing until you get down and you have to calculate your overhead rate here. So this is where you're going to allocate your indirect costs here that you can't directly trace to the job itself. So the difference here is for our actual costing, we're going to use our actual overhead rate, and we can only calculate that at the end of the period or at the end of the year when we accumulate all our overhead here for the plant for all those different jobs that we're running through the plant. So we can only calculate that here. Say at end of the year, we can make the calculation. But when we talk about normal costing, this is where we're going to, instead of using the actual overhead rate, we use a applied overhead rate here, or what they call a predetermined overhead rate here, based on some budgeted amounts here. We can apply this overhead rate here to the job, or when it goes through a particular operation here, we can apply that overhead rate to the job here. And then we know the total dollars up through that point here that we have for the job. We know the actual direct material here, direct labor, and we'd also have a good close estimate on how much overhead is going to be applied to that job. So we know the cost of that job as it's flowing through the factory here when the operation is complete. Whereas with actual costing, we don't know the actual cost here of that job until we can, at the end of the period or end of the year, and we can determine the actual overhead that would cost that would be applied to the job. So we're going to look at calculating both this actual overhead and our applied overhead. So before we do that, let's go up and let's look at what we're talking about here. So for our example here, all our jobs going through the factory, we have a total indirect cost that's not directly traceable to our jobs here, and that would be our overhead cost, and we're going to estimate that at $800,000 here for the year. And then our individual job, we're going to be tracking that cost individually here. So what portion of this $800,000 in total overhead costs here can be allocated to the individual job that we're being manufactured? So that's the question that we're looking at, and we're going to be this allocation is going to be based on direct labor hours here. So for any amount of direct labor hours that is tied to their individual job, based on our calculations here, we'll be able to determine how much overhead costs we'd allocate. So looking at the case here, for our overhead, $800,000 cost, our total overhead costs that we're estimating, we're looking at that, basing it on a total amount of 16,000 direct hours here. Again, an estimated amount for the year, and for our particular job that we're looking at, we're estimating that, or we're going to actually determine it to be 900 direct labor hours that we have for the year. So of the 16,000 direct labor hours, 900 of those direct labor hours are going to be attributed to this individual job that you'll be tracking. Okay, so let's go and let's make our calculations here. So what we're going to do here, we'll start with this applied overhead rate, that predetermined overhead rate. So what we're going to do is that's going to be based on take our total budgeted indirect costing dollars here for the year here, and that would be as of the beginning of the year, and then we would divide it by the total budgeted direct labor hours that we have for the year here. So for our example that we're looking at for our predetermined rate here, we had total indirect labor hours, direct costs, here of 800,000, and that was total direct labor hours here of 16,000. So that division is going to give us our predetermined overhead rate here of $50 per hour. Now that's, again, as of the beginning of the year, that's that budgeted amount here, and that's the predetermined amount. And we can also look at it in terms of percentages here. Quite often that's a value here when you're looking at it in terms of percentage. So we got the total for every direct labor hour we have spent on this product here. We are going to have to allocate to it $50 here per hour for our indirect costs here, our overhead rate. So looking at it in terms of a percentage here, taking that $50 here per hour here of the applied overhead rate that we calculated, divide it, and let's say our direct labor hours here are based on $15 per hour. So this predetermined rate here is really 333% of our direct labor hours. So that can become used very handily here when you're making your calculations. So what we've done here in this case here, we've looked at our beginning of the year, we have this budgeted or this predetermined overhead rate, and I looked at it in terms of just the overall plant operation. But if you were actually having to come up with these, using these applied overhead rates or the predetermined overhead rates, you'd probably want to do it for each of the departments in the factory here. So as this, and you would have to go through the same procedure here. But say the product's going through the factory, or this job's going through the factory, and it goes through each of those different operations in different departments, you'd have a different rate here for each of those departments or operations that you're looking at it, and then you would take that rate times the hours that the job or that product is going through here to determine the exact overhead rate. But we're just looking at it in terms of an overall overhead rate here. So again, predetermined or budgeted indirect cost rate for each. And what I was speaking of is cost pools here, or the department here, each of the departments in the plant that you'd have. And then you could use each of those cost pools, have that predetermined rate to determine the actual or the allocated overhead for that particular job. And then, again, let's remember this predetermined amount is calculated at the beginning of the year here. Now, looking at our actual overhead, again, end of the period, this is where you're going to take your actual total indirect cost here, and that indirect cost for both of them. The predetermined was based on the budgeted indirect cost. Now at our actual amount, this is the actual total indirect cost. And that we only know as of the end of the year here, or end of the period. And then again, you just divide it by your total actual direct labor hours to determine your rate here. So in this case here, for our example, our actual total indirect cost here was $688,800 versus the $800,000 that we budgeted or we estimated as of the beginning of the year. But as of our actual amount as of the end of the year, we have $688,800 here of total indirect cost here. And then our actual direct labor hours, as of the end of the year, we have a total of 16,400 versus our budgeted amount we had at 16,000. So our division here for our actual overhead rate, 688,800 divided by 16,400, gives us an overhead rate that we apply here at $42 per hour. So for each direct labor hour that this job is accumulating here, $42 per hour is the actual overhead rate that we would use here. So you can see this is the beginning of the year based on our budgeted amounts. We had $50 per hour. Actual amount here is $42 per hour. So our actual rate here is lower than what we initially budgeted at. And then just again as a percentage here, $42 here per hour divided by, say, our standard hour labor or direct labor hour rate here, $15 per hour, is going to give us 280% here percentage here based on every direct labor hour. So our overhead rate here is 280% times our direct labor hours times the number of hours that you go in here. So difference, we were sitting at 333%. We're down now to 280%. Okay, so this is the difference here. Actual overhead rate, you only know it, you can only calculate it as of the end of the year here by using your actual total indirect cost divided by your actual total direct labor hours that you had for the year here. And we looked at it just in terms of one overall plant overhead rate here. But you would have to go through this procedure for each of the different departments that this product would be passing through or the job would be passing through. So the applied amount is a budgeted amount as of the beginning of the year, and then we can use that applied amount here to determine our cost as this job flows through the plant here. And that's the reason you want to do it here. You want to know your cost as the job goes through the plant here, so you know and you can manage your costs here in a timely basis here. Whereas with your actual costing, you really don't know your actual cost here until the end of the year when you can determine your actual overhead cost and apply it to that particular job. Okay, so the only difference is how and when you apply this actual overhead, or your actual overhead rate here versus your applied overhead rate. Normal costing, use your applied overhead rate. Actual costing, use your actual overhead rate. Okay, and so for our example, let's move down here. To determine our overhead cost here, all you do is take that overhead rate here times the direct labor hours that you'd have. So that's going to equal your overhead cost. And for our example, we're just going to say what we had looked up at above here. We have 900 actual hours here for that job that we're looking at. So for our applied overhead rate, as of the beginning, or based on for our normal costing, we have taken that $50 per hour here times those 900 hours here for the job. That's going to give us $45,000 here of applied overhead that we have. So that's based on that predetermined or that budgeted amount. And then for our actual cost, what we have as of the end of the year, we just take that $42 per hour here times, in this term, the job total direct labor hours here was 900 hours. That's going to give us $37,800 here in overhead that we're applying. So for our actual cost. So you can see our applied amount that we did for this job based on the job flowing through the factory here was greater than the actual amount. But again, pretty close approximation, and using this applied rate here, we're able to determine our cost as that product flowed through the plant. Whereas with the actual, we didn't really know the product cost here, and we couldn't really manage those costs until we knew at the end of the year here, and that's way down the road here. So applied for normal costing, use it to determine your costs as that product flows through the plant. Okay, so let's go over here. Okay, now let's just look at those dollars flow here, and we'll look at it in terms of our T accounts here. So really what we're looking at here is we want to determine our cost of goods manufactured here. So really that's ultimately what we're looking at here. And again, we're looking at our normal costing here, our applied overhead rate here for our normal job costing versus our actual job cost. So what you want to do here, just looking at these T accounts, you're going to have a manufacturing overhead control account here, and then those dollars flow into a work in process control account. And then in our work in process, again, we can determine our cost of goods manufactured. So looking at our manufacturing overhead control account here. So again, I've got it separated out here, that indirect material used. If you can identify it and you keep a track of it separately here for the actual cost times the actual quantity, you would want to do that. And also indirect labor here used, if you want to keep track of it as in actual cost versus actual quantity. If you can track it separately here, because say we're talking about that maintenance support for this particular job, quite often you can keep that separate from your actual indirect overhead costs. So you might want to separate those out, but you still would want to keep it in your manufacturing overhead control account here. So what we would do here, our debit amount, what's sitting here in our manufacturing overhead control, thus based on our actual costing, we'd have our actual indirect overhead amount here. We only know that at the end of the year here, or end of the period. We have to calculate it. We only accumulate it in this manufacturing overhead control account here until the end of the period, end of the year. Then we know that total amount. And then again, I just kept the indirect labor here used and indirect material here used in this account here. But you could, and again, those here would be could flow into your work in process control account here if you know exactly what those amounts are here. But nonetheless, they're sitting in your manufacturing overhead control account. Now, what do we credit out here in our manufacturing overhead control account? Well, using our actual costing method here, we can only credit out the total dollars here as of the end of the period, end of the year here. But what we would do here for using our normal costing, this is where we apply it to the job at the time it's used here. So we would credit out here based on our applied or our normal costing here. We'd use that applied manufacturing overhead rate here. That's what we were talking about, that $50 per hour times whatever direct labor hours you have. So whatever your applied rate is, you take that times your direct labor hours here, and that's what would be allocated. So we're just looking at our applied manufacturing overhead rate here. We're using our normal costing. We'd credit out our manufacturing overhead account, and that would move into our work in process control account here at the applied indirect overhead rate. And then in this case, it was $45,000 here. Now, that was based on end of the year direct labor dollars here, but you'd have some amount here based on whatever direct labor dollars you were accumulating for that job throughout the year here. And again, the other thing we have in our work in process control account would be our direct material used. That doesn't go into our manufacturing overhead account, and also our direct labor used. Again, that goes directly into the work in process account here. So you know what your costs are, because those are tied directly to the product. And the other thing is, I'm just also threw in this indirect material used and indirect labor used here. You could move those out of your manufacturing overhead control account into your work in process account. Okay, so what goes into the cost of good manufacturing? You would take whatever applied indirect cost you have at that time, you would put that could go into your cost of goods manufactured. Now, this cost of goods manufactured here really wouldn't come out of your work in process here. Wouldn't have to come out of the work in process here until the end of the year here. But when you want to look at it and track that job cost throughout the year here, you could easily calculate it based on that applied indirect overhead rate. But the point is, this is what's going on here. So your cost of good manufacturing, if it's based on that applied overhead rate, we'd have that $45,000 here. Everything else is the same here. Direct material and direct labor used here is the same here, using our actual cost or our normal costing. The only difference is how we apply that overhead rate. So for our example here, based on our normal costing here, we have $45,000 here in applied overhead rate versus our actual cost here, $37,800. So we have a difference of $7,200 here that was over applied for this job here based on our normal costing. So normal versus actual costing, you'd have to determine if you're over or under applied here on your overhead rate. But nonetheless, that your cost of goods manufactured, whatever amount you have there, is going to flow into your finished goods account down here. And I'm just putting in it at the normal costing, it flows into your finished goods account. Then you would debit your finished goods account for that, and then you would credit your cost of goods sold. That would go into whatever that amount is, it would go into your, you'd credit it out here in cost of goods sold, it flows into your cost of goods sold account here. And then the reason, and it's over allocated here, so if we had that based on our normal costing here, that cost of goods sold would have included that total $45,000 in overhead costs for the year here. So that would have been, then we have to go back and actually look at what our actual cost is. So we'd have to adjust our cost of goods sold here. And we'd have to have a year-end adjustment. We'd have to reduce it by $7,200 here based on our actual costs, because we would have been over allocated here had we used our applied overhead rate. So again, this cost of goods sold here, we have to have the year. It cost of goods sold if it was based on the beginning of the year budgeted estimate that we used here for the normal costing. All right, so the only difference between our normal costing and our actual costing here is how we apply that overhead rate. So just tracking it through here. You have your manufacturing overhead account, and if you had just used actual costing, you couldn't determine the exact, you wouldn't know what your cost was here until the end of the year here, and that you wouldn't really want to bring it out. You'd have to come up with some estimate here to credit it out to move it into your work in process. But when you're using actual costing, you really are limited here because you have to determine your actual cost as of the end of the period or the end of the year. Whereas with your applied or your normal costing here, when you use that budgeted overhead rate, then you can actually move it out of your manufacturing overhead account based on that budgeted rate, and then you can move it into your work in process account based on the budgeted rate. So the normal or applied overhead here for normal costing gives you the advantage here because you can determine what your costs are on a timely basis. After the operation is done here, you can use your applied or your estimated overhead rate, and you can determine your costing here. So I just went through these T accounts just to see how the costs flow in and out, and when you get down to your cost of goods sold. But regardless here, if you're using the applied overhead rate, you have to do a year-end adjustment. Somehow you have to adjust your year-end amounts. Either you're going to be under or over applied. In this case, we are over applied because we spent more here, and our applied overhead rate here was greater than the actual cost. But the reverse could be true, and then nonetheless you have to come in and you have to make some year-end adjustments. Okay, so that'll pretty much summarize our topic here on actual versus normal costing here when we talk about job order costing.